Okay, welcome everyone. This is our NIFA Biotechnology Risk Assessment Grants Research Technical Assistance Webinar for our recently announced RFA. This is our FY 2024 year. Next slide, please. So in this webinar, just a couple of meeting logistics. Hopefully everybody's that's here now isn't having any issues with Zoom. But if you are, you can call that number for tech support. And as I mentioned, this meeting is being recorded through the webinar portion. And so we've muted everyone's microphone. And so please make sure it stays that way. And then we will be posting this after the meeting to our RFA page website, as well as our program page. Next slide. In accordance with federal civil rights law and USDA civil rights regulations and policies, the USDA, its agencies, offices, and employees, and institutions participating in or administering USDA programs are prohibited from discriminating based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, gender identity, including gender expression, sexual orientation, disability, age, marital status, family parental status, income derived from a public assistance program, political beliefs, or reprisal or retaliation for prior civil rights activity in any program or activity conducted or funded by USDA. Remedies and complaints can be found in the following paragraphs. And this is also available for persons that require accommodations. You can find contact information for those in these paragraphs. Next slide, please. So first, we'll go ahead and introduce the BRAG team. Myself, I'm John Erickson. I'm a national program leader in the Institute of Food Production and Sustainability in our Plant Systems Production Division. So in addition to working on the BRAG program, I lead plant programs related to plant physiology and plant production. I see Tim is here. So Tim, you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, John. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm Tim Sullivan. This is my first year working with John and the rest of the BRAG team. I'm representing the Animal Systems Division. The other programs I work with at NIFA are the aquaculture programs, the animal health programs, and the AFRI program on genetics. Back to you, John.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, as you'll see, we got quite a few folks on the BRAG team. Even though it's a small program, we cover a lot of breadth to the program. So next slide, please. We also have a new program leader from our Plant Systems Protection Division that's kind of representing our entomology, plant microbial area. And that includes Tom Mitchell. I don't think Tom is here, so I'll go ahead and introduce him. As I mentioned, he's fairly new to NIFA. I think he's been here about a year now. And I think he's joining us from Ohio State, where he was the department chair of their plant pathology department, I believe. So we're glad to have Tom on board. And he will be joining us as we move forward BRAG program. The BRAG program is also administered jointly with the USDA Agricultural Research Service. And our program leader on the BRAG team from ARS is Jack Okamuro. And I don't think he is here either, but he is a national program leader with ARS and is also on BRAG. So next slide, please. And Pushpa, I see you come off mute. Are you going to introduce yourself? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Pushpa Katir. I'm a program specialist with the BRAG program. This is probably my 6th or 7th year, but it's not straight, but in between I did that. So
thank you, Pushpa. I know we're battling a cold there, so thanks for introducing. And I think Alejandra is here as well. Alejandra, would you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, so hi everybody. My name is Alejandra Godoy. I joined NIFA a couple months ago. I'm the secondary program specialist for the BRAG program. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so that's the BRAG team. So we'll go ahead and jump into a NIFA overview now. NIFA, as I'm sure most of you are aware, is sort of our extramural science funding agency within USDA's research, education, and economics mission area. NIFA invests in and supports initiatives that ensure long-term viability of agriculture. And NIFA provides funding and strategic leadership for programs that ensure groundbreaking discoveries in agricultural related sciences and technologies to reach people who can put them into practice. So, next slide. So yeah, the slide quickly went over there, showed just a breadth of the NIFA activities, and in the BRAG program represents many of the areas of agricultural science that we fund here at NIFA. As I mentioned, including things like biotechnology, which are related to BRAG, and then across the spectrum of plants, animals, and microbes. And then we also have programs in education, environment, food science, and even a small group of international engaged programs. Next slide. So first we'll talk about BRAG's purpose and priorities. These can be found on page 6 of the RFA. So as we go through the next several slides, you can kind of see these little boxes that will show you where you can find more detailed information about each of these things in the RFA. So the purpose of the BRAG program, it's been around, I think, since about 94, somewhere around the mid-90s. And it was started to support the generation of new information that will assist the federal regulatory agencies in making science-based decisions about the environmental effects of introducing genetically engineered organisms. The specific priorities that you'll find in the RFA, and these are the brief versions of them. The management practices to minimize environmental risks of genetically engineered organisms. Methods to monitor and understand the dispersal of genetically engineered organisms. Gene transfer between GE organisms and related wild and agricultural organisms, and environmental effects of genetically engineered relative to non-genetically engineered organisms in the context of agricultural production systems. And then we have another called other relevant research topics, and there's a whole list, I think, from A to J on those in the RFA. So there's much more detailed information on those specific priority areas within the RFA. The eligibility for the BRAG program is a little different than some of our other programs. It has to be a public or private research or educational institution or organization. So individuals, unless they're associated with those institutions, organizations, are not eligible. And you have to meet all other requirements that are discussed in the RFA. Next slide. So in terms of the application submissions and award limitations, there is no specific limit on the number of applications that an eligible institution may submit to this program as a lead institution. We've gotten this question somewhat frequently in the past. Since we've been doing these, I think don't get this question quite as often, but what that means is if there are 3 faculty members at NC State, North Carolina State University that want to submit a application, they are eligible to do so. As long as those are different applications, which we'll touch on in a second here, there's no limit from a particular institution. We do not allow duplicate submissions to the BRAG program or to any other NIFA program during the same fiscal year. And so what that means is if you write the same application, you can't submit it to 5 different NIFA programs during the same fiscal year. You can only submit that to one program. And the reasons for that should be obvious, but yeah, we don't want to be wasting all the reviewers' times, all reviewing the same application across different programs. And however, if you do have a different application, you can submit that to even to the BRAG program in the same fiscal year or to other programs. We do discourage this generally, however, because it does take a lot of time and effort to put together a quality application. However, in some cases, if you're just fine tuning a resubmission or something like that, you may have the bandwidth to submit a second application. And again, as long as that is different, that is allowed. So, next slide. The types of projects. So if you're familiar with the types of projects that NIFA funds, we often fund research, education, extension, integrated across those 3 types of projects. But the BRAG program specifically funds only research project types. So we do not support education, extension, or integrated projects, just research. And the grant types that BRAG program supports include standard grants, which we'll talk a little bit more in a second here, and conference grants. No, we do not have strengthening or collaborator type grants or any other grant types that you may be familiar with some of our other programs. Next slide. So no cost sharing or no matching is required for BRAG. And if, in fact, matching resources will not be factored into the review process for any of the evaluation criteria. So typically we don't see any matching and it's not required for BRAGs. Next slide. All right, so now we'll dive into more of the application details. So what should be included in your applications. And just to highlight quickly from last year, we didn't have any significant changes. There were some tweaks to some of the RFA priorities. The one thing many of you, if you haven't applied within the last year or so, may notice is that the budgets were increased in 2023 from 500,000 to 650,000, and that is also the case again in 2024. And so that's probably the biggest change that we made, but that was 2 years ago now. So that's will remain the same for 2024. Next slide. So more details on the applications. Mentioned you can find this RFA through the RFA website link here. And you can also check out some other information about the BRAG program, including some links to recently funded projects, which we'll also have in this presentation. And the more specific information related to the letter of intent. So the BRAG program encourages a letter of an intent. And the reason we do that is because the relevance to the regulatory agencies, which when we get to the criteria, you'll see a little more about that, is an important part of this program. And so we like to screen letters of intent to try to make sure that people are addressing that before they go ahead and put together a full application and submit that. So it is not required, but it is strongly encouraged that you submit a letter of intent. The current deadline for that is 5 p.m. Eastern time. And that one has a little more flexibility, but yeah, on January 11th, 2024, so we need it by then. And you can email that to Pushpa, who is, as you introduced, our program specialist. And more details on that or the letter of intent are found on RFA page 17. And then the hard deadline is for the application deadline is a hard 5 p.m. Eastern time on February 29th, 2024. And so we will try, if you do submit a letter of intent, to turn that around within a week or so, give you some feedback on the relevance to the program. And then the full application will be due by that February 29th deadline. All grant application materials are submitted through grants.gov. And I'll have a little more information on that in a second. And just a few facts about this program. The total funding available in FY24 is estimated to be about 5.5 million. That's just based on history, what it has been. BRAG is supported through a pretty complex budget approach. And so we never know exactly what it will be from year to year, but that's been the last couple of years have been pretty close to that. So the program code when you're submitting your application is HX. And as we mentioned, the maximum funding award is now $650,000 for research conferences, for research grants, and $50,000 for conference grants. And that $50,000 is sort of the upper limit. If you have a conference award, that's 25, that's still fine and acceptable for the program. Our recent success rates, since we did increase, the award sizes have gone down a little bit, but it's still around 30 to 35%. Next slide, please. So some of the key documents that are needed for your submission include the project summary and abstract, the project narrative, and the bibliography or reference list. These are what are called our key required documents, and then all other documents. If you don't submit any of these three, your application will be declined without review. And if you're missing some of the others, the application will still be reviewed, but it will negatively affect your application if you're missing some of these key documents like a data management plan, some of the other documents that are also required. And so for more detailed information on that, you can see your RFA. It'll spell out in detail what's required for each of these sections. Next slide. The project narrative should be the main part of your proposal. It's an 18-page limit. And again, this is strictly enforced. If you exceed this, your application will also be generally declined without review. If it's a sentence or two over, typically we'll let that through. But if it gets much more than that, then your application will be declined without review. And the 12-point font size includes text, figures, tables, anything that's put into your project narrative. The one exception to that is if you have a resubmission, you are allowed an additional page to respond to previous review. This does not count towards your 18-page limit. So in that case, it would basically be 19 pages. And so within this 18 pages, you should have your introduction, your rationale and significance, your objectives, your experimental plan. And if you are requesting centers of excellence, that should also be included within that 18-page limit. You don't get any additional pages or space for center of excellence requests. Any discussion of cooperation or institutional involvements, project timelines, all of that would also fall within the 18-page limit. So yeah, as you mentioned, applications exceeding this page limit will be declined and returned without review. We have to hold a pretty strict line with that just to make sure that all applications are treated fairly. Next slide, please. The data management plan. So that again is something we now is getting more and more scrutiny with the greater emphasis on data and data management. And so investigators are expected to provide a fairly detailed data management plan up to 2 pages that describes your expected data types, data formats, your storage and preservation methods, data sharing, protection and public access, and roles and responsibilities. And you can find, like I said, a little more about this in the RFA, either through that link or on page 21 of the RFA. Next slide. All right, so your application, as we mentioned, will be submitted through grants.gov. We only accept electronic submissions. And if you need the detailed guide that will give you more information about each section, the attachments, all those types of things, the link is provided here. And all submitted documents must be PDF to be accepted by NIFA, so you can attach Word documents or any other differing formats. And they should be including all of your narrative, budget justifications, any of those type of documents should be submitted as PDF. Even if grants.gov allows other formats, NIFA does not, and they will not be pulled in to our systems if they are not in PDF. So you will have parts of your application that will not make it through for review. So it's critical that you have those in PDF format. Next slide. So how do we evaluate proposals once they've been reviewed, screened, accepted, and ready for review? We assign those proposals that are accepted for review to a panel of your peers. And that would include at least 3, and in the BRAG program, that's what we use, is 3 reviewers with expertise and at least at some level in the proposed topics. Like I mentioned, the BRAG program that can be somewhat challenging sometimes given the breadth of applications that we receive for the number of applications and number of panelists that we use. And so you'll have experts with gene editing or something like that, but they may work with plants more than microbes, and at least one of the reviewers. So we try to make sure we have at least all expertise is covered or represented to some extent in that review group. And if not, we'll tend to use ad hoc reviewers. So reviewers will each produce their own individual reviews of each proposal. that describe the strengths and weaknesses according to the criteria that are discussed in the RFA. And then these written reviews are the kind of starting point for the panel discussion. So the reviewers will bring your objectives and approaches to the panel, and then discuss what they found as strengths and weaknesses. And then through these discussions, the panelists will come to a consensus and propose a final rating and ranking of all the proposals. Next slide, please. I think, I was going to say there's more on the criteria. Just in terms of the ranking, again, one of the nice things about NIFA is that the panelists and the review efforts are used very seriously to make our funding decisions, and those rankings are generally what we use to fund all of our applications. The criteria are first and foremost scientific merit of the proposal, the qualifications of the proposed project personnel, and that includes all aspects of the project, the adequacy of the facilities to conduct the proposed work, and the relevance of the project to solving biotechnology regulatory uncertainty for U.S. agriculture. And one thing I'll add here, kind of tied to that, the last 2 points, is if you have any sort of genetically engineered organism that you're working with, it's helpful in your applications if you include the status of any permits or anything that you have to work with those, say, in the field from the differing agencies. That is very helpful to convince the panel that you will be able to conduct a proposed work within the time frame you indicate. The RFA has more details on these specific criteria, and so I definitely encourage you to look at that further. Next slide. So the timeline is generally pretty close to this. Like I said, brag can be a little bit longer in some instances towards the end, and I'll comment on that in a minute. But typically, once we have the RFA deadline, it takes us 1 to 2 months to kind of the RFA publication deadline. 1 to 2 months to allow for applications to be submitted, time for proposals to be written, and then the application deadline. Once the application deadline, it's a couple, 2 to 3 months for proposal review, and then proposal funding notifications. And then once those are done, it goes to our awards management division, and it takes them another month or two to kind of finalize that. So the typical process once a competitive program launches an RFA is about 3 to 5 months. Because that brag tends to be on the latter side of that because we have a complex budget that depends on other programs' budgets, and is funded through interagency agreements with ARS and Forest Service as well. And so it takes a little extra time to kind of get all of those funding mechanisms in place. So it can take a little bit longer to get those awards out the door. Next slide, please. And just to comment on that, if you do have any questions along the way, we'll probably send out an acknowledgement email after receiving the applications to kind of give you a heads up of when we expect some of the decisions to be made. But if it's too far beyond that date that we provide, always feel free to reach out to the program and just get an update on where we're at with things. So if you have a interest in what's been funded by the program, and I think it's very good to look at that. If you are interested in submitting, in a particular area, it's always helpful to see what has been funded in that area and what types of work that the panel and the program have found relevant to their past, especially more recent RFAs. And one way you can go about doing that is through our CRIS. At least for now, our CRIS database has all of the funded awards. And this particular link on this slide will take you to, I think, all of the brag projects. You can also filter by year, but this will take you to everything that's been funded through the brag program. And we'll show sort of the non-technical summary, their objectives. And for the projects that are further along, you can also see their annual reportings as well. Next slide. And just a few more general things to wrap up here, and then we can take some specific questions if there are any. The NIFA broadly has a calendar that they post upcoming events that includes deadlines, meetings, webinars, like this type of webinar that can be found at the NIFAUSDA.gov events link. And specifically for RFAs, there's an RFA calendar that will tell you when these RFAs are expected to be released. Again, sometimes they're delayed a bit, but that gives you at least a decent idea. And it has all of the programs, including BRAG, that NIFA offers. Next slide. And there's a lot of information that's helpful when you put an application together for NIFA, including BRAG, but to all of our programs that may not necessarily be found, at least in detail, in the RFA. And that's the funding opportunities link here. There's a competitive grants flow chart that kind of describes the process in a flow chart format. And particularly helpful is the NIFA grant resources and the NIFA policy guide, which is helpful both before and after receiving awards. And if you have more questions on indirect costs, there's a pretty good site there to help you understand the indirect costs for NIFA. And a guide to preparing and submitting through grants.gov. And also any information that we just discussed, through Chris, you can find more details on that as well. So, next slide. I think that's it, right? Pushpa. Yeah. So if you do have any questions, that come up after this webinar, or if you're listening to this webinar online, please feel free to reach out to our team. You could start with me or Pushpa, and we'll send it to any of the rest of the team members that may be relevant for input. And so I think with that, we will wrap up our recorded part of the session, and then we can go ahead and take any questions or comments through the Q&A portion.